He was fixing up his own gym when she stormed in, dead sure he was a crook. Minutes later, cops rolled up. But things didn't go how she figured. What went down here? Stick around to find out. It's a wild ride you won't see coming. Before we jump in, tell me in the comments, what town are you watching from? I'm curious how far this story's traveled. If you like a good yarn that hits home, hit that like button and subscribe. I've got more real-life tales coming your way every day. Let's get rolling. Excuse me, what are you doing in here? The voice screeched through the quiet hum of the gym, sharp enough to rattle the neon lights overhead. Darius froze mid-twist, wrench still locked on the rowing machine's bolt, and turned toward the sound. A woman stood at the entrance, purse clutched like a lifeline, her eyes boring into him with raw suspicion. She'd already decided he didn't belong. Probably a thief, she thought, caught fiddling with the equipment. Fixing a machine, he said, his tone flat, unshaken. She marched closer, heels clicking on the polished floor. Oh, really? You work here? Her words dripped with doubt, and Darius tilted his head. He'd heard that tone too many times before. I don't just work here, I own this place, he fired back, setting the wrench down with a deliberate clank. She barked a laugh, short and brittle, her mind racing. Owner? Him? More like some janitor spinning lies. Yeah, right, she sneered, digging her phone from her purse with quick, angry jerks. Darius felt the old sting flare up. 15 years of pouring sweat into this gym, and still, here it was again. A smirk tugged at his lips as he watched her fumble with the screen. Lisa stabbed at her phone with a trembling finger, her eyes never leaving the man she'd pegged as trouble. Yes, hello? There's a man here messing with the equipment at Jackson's Fitness, she said, her voice tight with urgency. She thought she had him now, caught in the act, no way out. He says he owns it, but I don't believe him. Across the gym, Darius leaned against the rowing machine, arms crossed, watching her play out her little drama. You're calling the cops on me in my own gym? He asked, his tone dry enough to crack the air. She shot him a glare, her mind set. He's bluffing, and I'll prove it. That's right, she snapped back. If you're the owner, you won't mind showing it when they get here. The dispatcher's muffled voice buzzed through, and Lisa's lips curled with a smug satisfaction. Darius unfolded his arms, stepping closer as she clutched the phone like a trophy. Let's get this straight, he said, his voice low and sharp. You saw a black man fixing a machine and figured I didn't belong here. The words hit her like a slap, but Lisa bristled, her thoughts scrambling. How dare he twist this? Don't you make this about race, she spat, her face flushing red. In her head, she was the hero, protecting this fancy gym from some shady character. Darius gave a faint smirk, reading her like an open book. I don't have to, he replied. You're doing that just fine. She huffed, turning away to bark at the dispatcher. Hurry up, he's not leaving. Darius stood his ground, the years of proving himself flashing through his mind. Every doubter, every sideways glance, all leading to this ridiculous moment. Red and blue lights flickered through the gym's windows, cutting the tension like a knife. 2 officers stepped in, boots thudding on the floor, and Lisa wasted no time. Officers, over here, she called, pointing at Darius like he was a stray dog she'd cornered. He's claiming he owns this place. I told him to leave, but he won't. Her mind raced with triumph. They'll see through him now. The taller officer turned to Darius, his face unreadable. Sir, you work here? He asked, voice clipped. Darius didn't flinch. No, I own this gym, he said, steady as ever. Lisa scoffed loud enough to echo off the walls. No, he doesn't, she insisted, her certainty unshaken. She thought she'd won, but the air felt heavier than she expected. Darius reached into his sweatshirt pocket, slow and deliberate, pulling out his wallet while the officers watched. He handed over his driver's license, his eyes locked on the taller one. Papers for the gym are in the office if you need more, he said, his voice calm but firm. He'd done this dance before, proving what was his, and it never got easier. Lisa crossed her arms, her thoughts buzzing. Fake ID, probably. He's stalling. He's lying, she muttered, loud enough for everyone to hear. The officer glanced at the license, then back at Darius while his partner shifted her weight, sizing up the scene. Lisa's heart thumped with anticipation. She could almost taste the moment they'd haul him out. But Darius just stood there, unflappable, waiting for the truth to do its work. The officer squinted at the license, then his eyes lit up. Wait! "Darius Jackson?" he said, a grin breaking through. Outside, a small crowd had gathered, passers-by drawn by the flashing lights and raised voices, phones out, filming through the glass. "I know you," he added, handing the ID to his partner, who nodded. "Those free workout classes for kids in 20? My nephew love 'em." Lisa's jaw dropped, her mind a mess. "No way! That's nonsense," she shouted, shoving forward, her voice shrill. "He's a liar! Arrest him!" The crowd buzzed louder, cameras rolling, catching her every word. The officer's grin faded. "Ma'am, step back," he barked, then turned to her, stern. "You called 911 over nothing. You know that's a crime." Lisa's eyes widened, panic spiking. "A crime? Me? I was just—" She sputtered, her hands flapping. Darius watched, his face still, but inside he felt the shift. This wasn't just her mistake anymore. It was her mess. Darius let out a low, dry laugh, his gaze pinning Lisa where she stood, trembling. "You were so sure I didn't belong you couldn't wait to call him," he said, his voice slicing through her fear. The taller officer crossed his arms, glaring at her. "Did you ask him anything before wasting our time?" he demanded, his patience gone. Lisa's mouth worked like a fish out of water, her thoughts crashing. I was sure, I just, she stammered, shrinking under the crowd's stares. "No crime here," the officer snapped. "Mr. Jackson owns this gym." Darius met her eyes, unyielding. "See that now?" he asked, and she felt her world tilt, the phones outside still recording her unraveling. The officer turned to Darius, softening. "Mr. Jackson, sorry for the hassle," he said, tipping his head. Darius nodded, exhaling slow. "Appreciate it," he replied, steady as ever. "You filing anything?" the officer asked, eyeing Lisa. She flinched, clutching her purse like it could save her, her mind screaming, "File? Against me?" Darius studied her, red-faced, rattled, then shook his head. "Nah," he said. "She's paid enough tonight." The words stung worse than a slap, and Lisa's knees wobbled. The officers headed out, boots fading into the night, while the crowd lingered, whispering and filming. Darius picked up his wrench and turned back to the rowing machine, letting the silence swallow her whole. Darius twisted the gym's lock shut, the click cutting the silence. He leaned against the door, wrench in hand, and exhaled slow. At 55, he'd faced this before, folks seeing a black man and jumping to conclusions. 15 years building this place, and still, some couldn't see past their own doubts. But he knew his worth, forged in sweat and grit, unshakable. His phone buzzed as he stepped inside, Jim's text, boss videos going wild. Darius glanced at the screen, Lisa's shouts, the crowd's hum, his steady voice slicing through. He shook his head, a wry twist to his lips. She'd aimed to ruin him, but now her red-faced rant was all over Chicago. The whispers of the crowd lingered, a judgment she couldn't dodge. Darius set the phone down and picked up the wrench, turning back to the rowing machine. Under the neon glow, he tightened the last bolt, hands steady, letting the gym's silence wrap around him like a hard-won peace. Darius Jackson unlocked the gym door at dawn, expecting the familiar hum of Jackson's fitness to greet him like it had every morning for 15 years. Instead, he stopped cold. Weight cables hung slashed, a stack of plates lay scattered like fallen dominoes, and the security camera lens dripped with black spray paint. He'd seen rough days, but this hit different, too personal. "Jim," he called, his voice sharp with a mix of anger and disbelief. His night manager jogged over, wide-eyed. "Somebody got in, boss, trashed it good." Darius crouched, spotting flecks of paint under a bench, his gut twisting. This ain't no accident. Whoever did this wanted him to hurt, and he had a hunch who'd be smiling about it. Across town, Lisa sat in her dim kitchen, a cup of coffee cooling beside her as she replayed a shaky video on her phone. The grainy clip showed hooded figures slicing cables and toppling weights, her hired hands at work. A thin, satisfied smile crept across her face. "That'll teach him," she muttered, her voice low and bitter. She'd never taken kindly to being crossed, and Darius had made a fool of her in front of everyone. He shamed me, now he'll lose it all, she thought, sipping her coffee with a gleam in her eye. This was her payback, and she savored every second of it. Darius ran his fingers over the slashed cables, the edges jagged under his calloused hands. This wasn't some kid's prank. Someone meant business. He grabbed a flashlight and swept it under the benches, spotting more paint flecks glinting like tiny clues. Lisa's smug face from that night flashed in his mind. Her voice still rang in his ears, dripping with spite. "Jim, check the street cameras," he said, his tone hard as steel. Jim hustled to the office, muttering, "Whoever did this ain't too bright." Darius's jaw tightened. "She's behind this. I'd bet my last dollar." He'd spent 15 years building this gym, pouring every ounce of grit into it, and he wasn't about to let anyone tear it down. Not her, not anybody. He pocketed a paint chip, evidence, he figured, and started piecing it together. Lisa hunched over a chipped table in a rundown coffee shop, her purse tucked close, as three rough-looking fellas slid into the booth. Jake, the wiry one with a scar across his knuckles, leaned in. "Job's half done. Jim's a mess," he rasped, grinning. Lisa slipped an envelope of cash across the table, her fingers steady. "Good. Now finish it," she said, her voice cold and low. "Break every last thing he's got." She'd hired them through a cousin's shady friend. No one tie it back to her, she thought. He'll be ruined, and I'll be free of this. Jake pocketed the cash, nodding. "You got it, lady." Lisa's eyes gleamed as she pictured Darius standing in the wreckage, his pride smashed to bits, just like he'd smashed hers that night. Jim came back with a laptop, the grainy street camera footage flickering on the screen. "Look here," he said, pointing to three shadowy figures slipping out of the alley near the gym. Darius squinted. One of them had a limp he'd seen before. "That's Jake," he muttered, the name clicking like a lock turning. Jake was a local troublemaker, always stirring up mess in the neighborhood. "Figures," Jim said, shaking his head. Darius grabbed his phone and dialed Lou, an old pal who'd retired from the force but still knew every crook in town. "Lou, it's Darius. I need a lead on Jake," he said, keeping it short. Lou chuckled. "That punk, last I heard he's running errands for cash. What's he done now?" Darius's mind raced. If Jake's involved, Lisa's the one pulling strings. He wasn't guessing anymore. He was hunting. Darius sat across from Officer Brooks, the same cop from that night, in a cramped precinct office, sliding the paint chip and street video across the desk. "Somebody tore up my gym and I reckon it's her," he said, voice steady but burning. Brooks watched the footage, frowning. "Lisa, huh?" "She's got a grudge, all right." He tapped the paint chip. "This'll help, but we need more." Darius nodded. "Set a trap. I'll fix the gym. Let him try again." Brooks leaned back, sizing him up. "Risky, but I like it. We'll be ready." Darius's thoughts churned. She thinks she's smart, but I've got her number. He'd spent years keeping this place alive, through busted pipes, bad loans, you name it, and he wasn't backing down now. Brooks pocketed the evidence. "Let's nail her good," he said, a grim smile tugging at his lips. Late that night, the gym's lights flickered as Jake and his crew crept back in, crowbars glinting in their hands. Darius had patched things up just enough. Bait for the trap. A weight stack crashed, metal screeching, and then sirens wailed outside. "Cops!" one thug yelped, bolting for the door. But Brooks and his team swarmed in, flashlights blinding. "Hands up!" Brooks barked, pinning Jake to the floor. The scar-faced punk squirmed, then spilled it fast. "Lisa, she paid us! Said to wreck it all!" Across the street, Lisa watched from her car, her smug grin melting into panic. "No, they weren't supposed to talk." She fumbled with the keys, heart hammering, but the headlights caught her, too late to run. Darius stood in the shadows, arms crossed, watching the chaos unfold, a quiet fire in his chest. Brooks banged on Lisa's car window, badge flashing. "Out, now!" he ordered, voice like gravel. She stumbled out, hands shaking, her mind a mess. "How'd he figure it? I didn't do nothing," she yelled, but her voice cracked, hollow against the evidence piling up. Jake's confession, the video, the cash trail. Brooks snapped the cuffs on, tight and cold. "Vandalism, conspiracy." "You're done," he said, steering her to the squad car. She twisted back, glaring at Darius through the gym's glass doors, her thoughts wild. He can't win this. But he already had. Darius met her stare, silent, unflinching. He'd outsmarted her every move. The crowd from that first night had seen her shamed. Now the law had her caught. She slumped as the car door slammed shut. The squad cars rolled off, red lights fading into the dark. taking Jake, his crew, and Lisa with him. Jim clapped Darius on the shoulder, grinning. "They're cooked, boss. She messed with the wrong guy." A few early risers, regulars who'd stuck by him, nodded from the doorway, their murmurs warm with relief. "Knew you'd handle it," one said, tipping his cap. Darius bent down, picking up a busted cable, his hands steady despite the long night. "This Jim's mine. No one takes it," he thought. He'd fought for this place before. Through lean times, doubters, now this. And he'd fight again if he had to. The hum of Jackson's fitness crept back, quiet but strong, as the first rays of sunrise hit the glass. Lisa sat in a holding cell, the clang of the door still ringing in her ears. Her phone, once her weapon, was gone, replaced by grainy videos of her hired thugs now playing on every news channel in town. Friends turned away, neighbors whispered, and her mind spun. All for nothing. She'd wanted Darius broken, but she'd shattered her own life instead. The cuffs bit into her wrists, a cold reminder of the price she'd paid. Her spite had landed her here, alone and undone. Darius stepped back into the gym, the neon lights casting a steady glow over the patched-up machines. Justice had rolled in like a slow freight train, and Lisa's prejudice had fueled its tracks right to her own downfall. He tightened a bolt, feeling the weight lift. Folks might judge, but they couldn't take what he'd earned. In the end, hate always turned on itself, and he'd still be standing. This tale's got a lesson carved in stone. Prejudice don't just hurt others, it boomerangs right back to the one throwing it. Lisa thought she could break Darius with spite, but she ended up breaking herself. Lost her freedom, her pride, all for nothing. He stood tall not because he's perfect, but because he earned his place with honest grit. Life's too short for judging folks by what you assume instead of what you see. Let this sink in. Hate digs its own grave, and what you build with hard work stands stronger than any lie. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to hit the like button, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you never miss out on more exciting stories every day. See you in the next one.